The ice sculpture was already sweating. It stood at the center of the cocktail terrace, a pair of swans, necks curved into a heart, and even in the early evening June heat, it was losing definition at the edges, the beaks softening, the wings beginning to merge into a single white mass. Someone had positioned it directly under one of the outdoor heaters. Whether that was an accident or indifference, the result was the same. A centerpiece dissolving in real time while the guests arranged themselves around it and pretended not to notice. I noticed systems failing before the people inside them do. It is not a skill I cultivated. It is simply how I am oriented toward the world. The Hargrove estate sat on 40 acres outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania, the kind of property that communicates wealth through inconvenience the long gravel drive. The hedgerows trimmed to geometric severity. The white tents that from a distance looked effortless and up close revealed the particular strain of things assembled to appear unconstructed. The string quartet was positioned at the far end of the garden, which meant the music arrived at the terrace already dispersed, ambient, like a rumor of elegance rather than the thing itself. I had driven from Pittsburgh that morning. I had a client call on Monday. I had already written my departure into the calendar for Sunday at 7, an exit that could not be argued with because it had the authority of work behind it, which is the only authority my family has ever fully respected, and even then only when it belongs to someone else. I found my table card in the foyer, 11, near the service corridor. I folded the card and put it in my clutch and went to find a glass of water. James found me first. He was moving through the terrace with Brooke on his arm, stopping at each cluster of guests with the practiced ease of a man who had rehearsed the route. He looked good. He always looked good. That was the thing about James. Dark suit, easy smile, the particular confidence of someone whose face had always gotten him into rooms and whose charm had kept him there. He kissed my cheek when he reached me and then kept moving, 2 steps, 3, drawing me into the wake of his trajectory without asking. "Stay close," he said quietly. "Tom wants to meet the family." Tom Wenzel. I had read about him without trying to. Wenzel Distribution appeared in the trade press the way large regional operators do, regularly and without drama, until 2018, when their Mid-Ohio hub collapsed under a sequencing failure that cost them 2 major contracts and made the freight industry journals for a quarter. They had recovered. Most people in the industry knew the name. James steered us toward the far end of the terrace where a group of 4 stood near the balustrade. Tom Wenzel was heavyset, late 60s, in a suit that needed pressing. He stood with the stillness of a man who had stopped needing to perform his own importance. Beside him was a white-haired woman I didn't know. 2 other men, presumably board level, flanted them. I had approximately 4 seconds to take in the geometry of the group before James began talking. "Tom," James stepped forward, hand extended, Brooke tucking neatly into his side. "You remember Brooke's cousin Ellen and this?" He turned, and his hand came to my shoulder in a gesture that looked, from the outside, like affection. "This is my sister Ashley. Our families," he smiled, the particular smile he used when cruelty needed an alibi. "Our family failure. Couldn't quite figure out what she wanted to be when she grew up." The 2 board-level men smiled reflexively. Brooke looked at her bouquet. My mother, appearing from somewhere at my left, gave a small, apologetic laugh that was worse than the silence would have been. Tom Wenzel did not smile. He was looking at me with an expression I could not immediately classify, not pity, not discomfort. Something more focused than either. He extended his hand. "Ashley," he said, "what do you do?" I felt James's hand still on my shoulder. The slight increase of pressure. The message. "Network analysis," I said. "Supply chain systems. I run my own consultancy out of Pittsburgh." Tom Wenzel's hand paused in mine for just a half second before completing the shake. His eyes had not moved from my face. "Wenzel Distribution," he said. "You know it." "Some. What do you know?" James laughed, a short, social sound meant to signal that this line of conversation was unnecessary. "Tom, you don't need to get her started on." "Mid-Ohio Sorting Hub," I said. 2018. It presented as a carrier capacity problem. It wasn't. It was a sequencing assumption in your load scheduling, sequential batch processing on a system that needed dynamic slotting. The failure was baked in at the design stage. You lost 2 major contracts before the diagnosis. The terrace did not go quiet. The guests around us kept talking. The string quartet kept playing its dispersed music. But Tom Wenzel had gone very still, and the stillness had a quality to it that made the air in our small circle feel different. "Whitmore Foods," he said, "and DeLuca Industrial." "Yes." "The consortium submission," he said slowly. "The anonymous one, the one we actually implemented." James's hand left my shoulder. Tom looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at James. His expression did not change. It was already settled into something that required no further adjustment. "Your family failure," he said, and his voice was even and unhurried, and carried the particular weight of a man who has spent 40 years knowing exactly what things are worth. "Rebuilt my company." Nobody said anything for a moment that lasted considerably longer than a moment. James recovered first, because James always recovered. It was his most reliable skill. He said something light, redirecting, a joke about family teasing that I did not fully hear because I was watching Tom Wenzel, who was still watching me. "Thursday," Tom said to me, ignoring the recovery entirely. 9 o'clock. I'll have my assistant send the address." He handed me a card. Then he turned back to the white-haired woman and resumed whatever conversation James had interrupted, and that was that. My mother materialized at my elbow as the group dispersed. She touched my arm in a way that was meant to communicate solidarity, but communicated something more like damage control. "He was just teasing," she said. "James." "I know. He's under so much pressure today. The wedding and Tom and—" "Mom." She stopped. "I know," I said again and left her there. I found table 11, sat down, and ate a plate of salmon that was slightly overcooked. The ice sculpture finished dissolving somewhere around the first dance. By the time the cake was cut, it was a white puddle in a silver tray, and a cater waiter removed it with practiced discretion, and no one mentioned it, and the party went on. I had submitted the consortium analysis on a Thursday night in November 2018, under a dummy email, and the name A. Carter Consulting, which was technically accurate and practically invisible. The Midwest Freight Consortium had issued a public problem statement, standard practice, when an internal team is too close to a failure to see its shape. I was between larger contracts. I had a specific kind of restlessness that only resolves when there is a broken system to map. My apartment in Pittsburgh backs up to a rail-switching yard. At night, the freight moves through in long chains, and you can feel it in the floor, a low structural vibration that I have slept beside for 11 years and no longer consciously register except in its absence, when the yard is quiet, and the quiet feels wrong. I worked for 3 days under the fluorescent light of the kitchen because the overhead fixture had blown, and I subsisted on bad coffee and the particular quality of focus that arrives when a system is failing, and the failure has a logic, and you are close enough to feel it before you can name it. The problem was not the carrier. It was never the carrier. It was an assumption, one line of logic in the scheduling protocol, reasonable when volume was predictable, catastrophic when seasonal asymmetry stressed the network past the assumption's tolerance. I rebuilt the scheduling logic from first principles, ran it against their published volume data, wrote the analysis in 31 pages with appendices. I submitted it. I received a modest honorarium. I moved on. I did not know who used it. I had not followed up. Credit is a social currency, and I have always found it expensive to manage. Tom Wenzel's offices were in a glass building in downtown Lancaster, with a view over a network of loading bays and rail siding. We sat at a long table, and he slid a folder across without preamble. "Full audit, Mid-Atlantic Distribution Network. Routing, vendor contracts, approval chains, payment ledger. You'll have everything." "What are you looking for?" He was quiet for a moment. "Something I can feel but can't locate. That's the problem." In my experience, that is always the most serious kind of problem. The ones that present as instinct before they present as data. I signed the NDA and took the folder. I worked from Pittsburgh, 2 monitors, the yard cycling through its shifts outside the window. The data was voluminous and well-organized. Too well-organized in the way that sometimes means someone has been actively managing its appearance. Genuinely healthy systems tend toward a productive entropy. When everything is clean and consistent across 18 months of operations, someone has been cleaning. I started with routing, then vendor approvals, then the payment flows. The pattern emerged the way patterns do when you are looking at enough data with enough patience. Not in a single revelation, but in accretion, each anomaly too small to be definitive, each one pointing the same direction until the direction was undeniable. Small amounts, varied vendors, real services, real invoices, but volumes slightly, consistently off. The kind of off that a quarterly audit runs past because no single line item is large enough to flag. 43 transactions over 18 months. Aggregate, just under $200,000 in overbilled services funneled through a single mid-level authorization code. I pulled the authorization records. I sat with the name for a while. Then I got up and stood at the window. A freight train was moving through the yard below, a long chain of intermodal containers heading east. I watched it pass. Then I sat back down and finished the work. James came to my apartment on a Friday evening. He had always known when a room was changing temperature. He did not shout at first. He sat on my couch uninvited, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, the posture of performed candor. Before you finalize anything, one conversation with Tom, you could frame it as inconclusive. Anomalous patterns without sufficient evidence of. James. Intent. You can show correlation, but you can't actually establish. You know I can establish it, I said. The ease left his face. What was underneath was younger than I expected, and frightened in the way of someone who has spent years standing on a floor they believed was solid and has just felt it move. Brooke, he said. Think about Brooke. She doesn't know anything. She's completely. I know. Mom and Dad, what this does to them. I know what it does to them. Then how? He stopped, recalibrated. You've always resented me. Everything I had that you didn't every time they. Go home, James. He stood slowly. At the door he turned back. Family failure. His voice was quiet and precise. Funny how that lands now, right? You finally get to. Good night, I said. My mother called the next morning. The call was long and shapeless, and I held the phone away from my ear and let it run. My father called in the afternoon. His call was 4 minutes. He said, "He has a wife, Ashley. He has a life now." As if the existence of the life were a counterargument to the existence of the fraud. I know he does, I said. Your mother. Dad, I'll talk to you after. Silence, then, okay. It was the kindest thing he said to me that year. The board meeting was on a Wednesday. 6 people around a glass table, the loading bays visible below, cranes in slow motion, trailers backed to the dock, the patient machinery of a distribution network doing its ordinary work. I presented for 38 minutes. I did not editorialize. I did not contextualize. I put the data on the screen in the order it needed to be seen and let it make its own case, which it did, row by row, the pattern sharpening from noise into signal with the quiet inevitability of a proof completing itself. When I reached the authorization chain, I put the name on the screen without announcement. James Carter, repeated 43 times in the approvals column. No inflection, no pause, just the column and the name and the amounts and the dates. James was seated at the far end of the table. He had been brought in under the pretense of a regional operations review. He had understood within the first 10 minutes. I did not look at him when his name appeared on the screen. The data was looking at him. That was sufficient. When I finished, the room was quiet in the specific way of rooms, where something irrevocable has just occurred, and everyone present is calibrating how irrevocable. Tom Wenzel, at the head of the table, turned to the far end. James. One word, the room held it. James was silent for a long moment. The rehearsed ease was gone. There was nothing left in his face that he had put there on purpose. What remained was unmanaged and small. There was a debt, he said finally, quietly. Before Brooke, before the wedding. I needed capital, and I thought it was always going to be temporary. I was going to replace it when… Tom raised one hand. James stopped. That'll be a conversation for the attorneys, Tom said. He looked down the length of the table at me. The expression on his face was not warm, and it was not cold. It was the expression of a man who sees things accurately and does not require them to be otherwise. I introduced your brother to 40 people at that wedding as a rising executive, he said. A man with good judgment and a future in this company. He did not finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The data on the screen finished it. He made the offer 2 weeks later, by phone, VP of Network Systems. A salary I had never been paid, an infrastructure budget that would have been genuinely interesting to manage. No, I said. A pause. I expected that. Tell me what you'd need. Full independence over methodology. No institutional hierarchy over the work. A retainer, not a role. That's not nothing. No. I'll have the attorneys draw up a consulting arrangement. I thanked him and hung up and sat for a moment at my desk, in the particular quiet that follows a decision that has already been made, that you are simply now confirming. The legal process moved slowly and mostly out of sight, the way legal processes do. James retained counsel. My parents hired a mediator to manage what they called the family situation, and the phrase itself told me most of what I needed to know about how they had decided to hold it. Brooke filed for an annulment in October. I learned that from the trade press, in an item about the Wenzel executive restructuring, in which James's name no longer appeared. My mother did not call after September. My father calls occasionally. The drive from Pittsburgh, the weather in Columbus, nothing specific, the conversation of two people maintaining a line without knowing what to say across it. I took a new contract in November. A regional rail authority in western Pennsylvania, a freight routing delay pattern they couldn't source. Good work. The kind that requires you to hold an entire network in your mind simultaneously, every node and junction, before any single point of failure resolves. In December, I drove out to a switching yard in Altoona to walk the physical infrastructure, something I do when the data starts to abstract, when I need to remember that the system is also steel and weight and weather. It was a gray morning, cold, the kind of cold that has texture to it. A freight train was moving through on the center track, eastbound, a long chain of intermodal containers passing in steady procession. I stood at the chain-link fence with my coffee and watched it go.